So this is quite a big, don't know what to call it really, a big time in my life anyway, for Bhante to have died very, very recently, just yesterday, because I've known him for probably 45 years now. And he's been a constant throughout my whole adult life, because I was a very young man, still a boy really, when I first came to Sri Ratna. And so he's had a very, very big effect on me. And when someone's had that big effect on you over a long period of time, you don't know how much of an effect he's had. It's a little bit like your mum and dad, I suppose. My mum and dad have a massive effect on me, and still I'm just beginning to realise how much effect they've had on me. And Bhante's not quite like that, but it's a similar kind of thing. And I thought what I'd do this afternoon was just talk about some of Bhante's qualities that I have really appreciated over all that time I've known him. Because he had some remarkable qualities. He was a remarkable man. And probably some of you know some of these qualities already, but I just want to sort of underline them really by way of appreciation of him. An appreciation of just him as a person, but also of the effect that he had on me, which was considerable. I think I'll start with his courage. He was a man of great courage. When he was posted, he was in the army during the Second World War. He was posted out to India. And towards the end, at the end of the war, once the war had finished, technically he deserted. Didn't really matter because the war was over, so I don't think anyone was chasing after him, but he just left and wandered off into India, and met someone else who wanted to learn about the Dharma, an Indian man, and they literally tried to do what the Buddha did, which was to wander in India looking for teachers with absolutely nothing. You know, they had nothing with them. They burnt their passports. They just got rid of everything and just wandered and lived on the generosity of others for 2 years, looking for Buddhist teachers who they never actually met. They just met lots and lots of Hindu teachers, but they just couldn't find a Buddhist teacher. So the courage of doing that as a young man in another continent, in another country, and just off he went. I mean, that's something that I don't think I would have ever done. And as you probably know, he was very courageous in speaking what he considered to be the truth. And he made himself very unpopular in certain quarters by speaking the truth. There was a time in India, again, I had been reading his memoirs again a few years ago, and they are really remarkable actually. It's well worth reading his memoirs if you haven't already, especially the ones where he goes to India and then he leaves home. Well, he leaves the army and he becomes homeless, and then he ends up in Kalimpong. All that's really, really good. But when he was in Kalimpong, he had a lot to do with the Mahabodhi Society, who in Bombay, I think it was, and he went there quite often. And he eventually became the editor of the Mahabodhi Journal. And one day he was travelling around India giving talks, and he came back to Bombay to the Mahabodhi Journal, and he was informed that you've been sacked from the editorship. Now, if that were me, I probably would have been shocked and surprised and upset and maybe angry and gone home. But he didn't. What did he do? He just carried on editing the Mahabodhi Journal. He just ignored the sacking. Isn't that a remarkable thing to do? He just ignored that. He thought, no, they're wrong. So he just carried on editing that journal. And they just let him carry on as the editor of the Mahabodhi Journal. He knew that someone was machinating, is that the word? And he just wasn't going to let that happen. It's one of the things that I've most admired about Bhante is the fact that he will not let people do that to him. He will not let people walk over him. He just doesn't let it happen. And in those memoirs, there's quite a number of times when he just lets someone have it if they're acting badly towards him. There was one time when there was a man, he had a shop and he was doing something really bad, and Banshee just got really annoyed, so he went down to the high street and shouted into the shop, come out here, and he really told the man off in the street. He just would not let people do that to him. There was a time when he'd come back to England at the request of the English Sangha Trust, and then they began to act very badly towards him, and that hurt him, actually. It really hurt him, what happened to him then. We don't often think about that, the fact that some of the things that people have done and said to him actually hurt him. And that hurt him quite a lot, actually, and I know that because twice I've been with him. And when he starts talking about those times, he used to get really exercised. And there was one time we were sitting there, he just got up and he was walking up and down the room, and he was saying, who do they think they are? Why, who do they think they are to do this? And he was just really, really walking up and down, really exercised. And I thought, oh, that really, really hurt you. But even though those kind of things happened to him quite a number of times in his life, he just carried on saying what he thought he needed to be done and doing what he thought need to be done. I really admired that of him. It's one of the qualities of the individual. This is something that Banshee used to talk about a lot in the early days, was individuality and how we all need to try to become individuals. And of course, in those days, we thought it was fairly easy, and you just became an individual, stopped being a group member, okay. And we thought we were individuals, but now, looking back, I realised, no way, it takes a lot to become an individual. And Banshee did it. I would say that Banshee was an individual. And part of that is the courage to speak, the courage to say what you need to say at the time. And he placed great store by that, and I saw him do that many, many times. At the same time, when he needed to speak the truth to disciples, and he did need to do that a lot. I mean, he spoke the truth to us all the time, of course, but sometimes he needed to give us difficult truths and say things that he knew would be unpopular, and say to someone, no, I think you're wrong about that. And whenever he did it with soft eyes. He never polarized. I never saw him polarize with other people. It was always, sometimes he knew that he was going to say something which wasn't going to go down well. And he would say it anyway, but he would say it in a way which wouldn't antagonize. There's something, again, I learned from him, maybe 10, 15 years ago. At last I learned this, that a lot of the time you can say what you like as long as you say it with friendliness and goodwill and your eyes are soft. Then you can say a lot. But if you say it in a confrontative way, it often gets people's backs up. And Banshee was really, really good at that. He knew he was going to say something which would not go down well with someone. He did it in such a good way. I think, again, that was partly his courage, that he had the courage to say what he needed to say. And sometimes I've noticed myself, I'll need to say something and I'm frightened to say it. And so I'm defensive before I've even said it. And then the other person picks up on my defensiveness. And before we know it, we're like that. But Banshee never did that. He always said it with kindness and softness in his voice and empathy for the other person. That's right. He empathized even when he was disagreeing. It was really, really good to see. And it reminds me of the seminar. He did a seminar on the Metta Sutta. And there were 3 words. There were 15 qualities at the beginning of that sutta that the Buddha talks about that you need in order to develop metta. And Banshee went into each of those 50 qualities. And there were 3 of them that always strike me as being really important: uju, suju, and mudu. And I talk about these 3 a lot. In fact, if I were still a preceptor and I was going to ordain 3 people, I think I'd call one uju, the other suju, and the other mudu. That'd be really good, I think. People laugh at that, but I'm serious, because there's such good qualities. So uju means arrow, and therefore it means straight. Because if you've got a bent arrow, it's not going to go. So it's as straight as an arrow. Suju means really straight. Yeah, so it's uju, and then emphasizing really uju. And then the third one is mudu, which is soft, gentle, tender. And so what Bhante said in the seminar is uju. It means straightforward. It means direct, like an arrow is really direct, isn't it? Direct and straightforward. If you want to develop metta, if you want to practice the spiritual life, if you want to be a human being of any use to anyone, you need to be direct and straightforward and say what you mean. And then Suju, he said, it's as if the Buddha were really emphasizing that. Really direct. Yeah? Don't mince your words. Say what you mean. Mudu, soft, gentle, tender, but at the same time, do it with love and empathy and softness and tenderness for the other person's feelings. And I think Bhante had those qualities really, really tremendously developed. I'll talk about this other aspect of Bhante now, actually, which is his empathy for others, his willingness to really take a person in and talk to that person. I talked a bit about this last night, but I'll say a few more words now, which is many people, they only know the public Sangharakshita, the public Bhante. That is the Bhante that used to give loads and loads of talks and lectures. And they were lectures, actually, you know, long, full of stuff, full of points, lectures. And you hear him speak and you get a certain idea of the person. And then you read his books. And I know some people find his books rather difficult, especially the ones that he wrote himself, not the spoken word projects, which were other people taking his words and put them into a book. No, his own books. So you might read those and get a certain idea about Bhante, but that's what I call the public Bhante. There was a less public Bhante, a more intimate Bhante, which was, he would make statements in his public voice. And, okay, that's what Bhante thinks. I don't know. One of the most controversial things, I suppose, about Bhante is his whole idea of single sex and how people are better off practicing with their own sex and so on. And you know how difficult some people find that and how controversial that is, and maybe some of you find that really difficult, and that's one of the things that Bhante knew people would find difficult, and he said anyway. But so he had that was one of his main teachings. It's one of the main elements of our movement. Yet when he met people individually, he wouldn't insist. He was not doctrinaire. He would meet the person and listen to them and talk to them as they were, where they were at. I gave an example of this yesterday. I'm not going to give that example again, good as it is and funny as it is. I will actually. It's a really good one. Only you two are there, so the other guy, you haven't heard it. So I was in North Wales in a retreat centre, and we had a chapter, and there was this order member there who was tended towards the anger and irascibility. And he used to get into terrible scrapes. He ran the Buddhist Centre in Llangollen, and he'd often, fall out with people. And he was like, everyone was a bit frightened of him because you didn't know when he was going to lose it again. And he did really lose it when he lost it. He had red hair, one of those kind of people. And we'd have to talk him through these things and, trying to make points to him. And one day he went to see Bhante. And told Bhante about this element of himself. And Bhante said, yeah. Have you ever thought of getting married? And he was like, no. And, if you knew him, you would never ask him that, because no way would he ever think of getting married. He just wasn't in his mind at all. And Bhante said, well, I think maybe you should think about it. Why? And he said, well, because sometimes people who are prone to getting angry, they just need a really good partner who can sort of hold them and, be with them. And so he did. He came back and he told his sister, and we were all like, what? Bhante said, get married? And he said, yeah, more or less. So he got married and he moved to Australia and he's got 3 children now. I don't know how he's doing, whether it's what kind of effect it's had on him, but he just did. Now, I'm just saying this because Banshee takes the whole person in. He doesn't try to lay one on you what you should be doing. He listens to what you have to say. And this is not, okay, here's another really good quality of Bante's. I've never known him to give advice. Never known him to give advice. And he used to say, it's one of his main teachings to us, don't give advice. And order members, they didn't seem to be able to help themselves. They were always given advice, left, right and centre. I'm speaking in the past tense. It might even be still the case, just dealing out advice. And Bante would often say, don't give advice. Stop giving advice. So what did Bante do? So you go to see him with a problem, let's say. Oh, I don't know what to do, Bante. I don't know whether to do this or that. Or something's happening, it's upsetting me. I don't know what to do with it. And Bante wouldn't rush in with some advice. He would just talk it over with you. Oh, he'd say, oh, and what happens then? And how do you feel about that? And the two of you together would come up with a solution. And very often, you'd think that, he gave you the solution. But if you were questioned about it and talked about the conversation, you'd realise that step by step, you both got there together. So that was another thing. And still in the vein of talking about Bante and his Mudu side, and he had a very, very pronounced Mudu side, actually. I mean, he as you know, he can be very critical. He had a very critical mind. And he was very strong-minded and he knew what he thought and he would say what he thought. But the Mudu element was very strong in him. And one of the ways I saw it again and again was people were a bit frightened of Bante because of his position, really. He was the founder of a Buddhist movement. It was a fairly big Buddhist movement. And he was a rather distant figure. You didn't really know him because, it's hard to get to know Bante because the movement's so big and so on. So when people did meet him, they were a bit frightened of him. And I saw this time and time again in meals. You have Bante would come to your community and have a meal with you, or some bunch of people would have a meal with him, and it was really quiet. It was really hard to get a conversation going because people were all a bit in awe of him. And I saw him time and time again, just trying to put people at their ease. And actually, once you got rid of this idea that Bante was this great guy who started up the movement, and you're just with him as a person, he was a delight to be with, an absolute delight to be with. The last time I saw him was at Adhisthana last year, and I just had half an hour with him. I wish I'd have had longer with him, actually, but I was just talking to him about various things, and he was absolutely lovely. I wasn't sure whether he could hear me. And so I was shouting a bit. And I said, Bante, I'm not sure whether you're a bit deaf. He said, no, I'm not deaf. So I could shut up a bit. But he was more or less blind. And he was sitting there with his mouth sort of half open, smiling and listening like that to me. And he was just really, really listening and taking what I was saying in. And I was telling him, I'd written to him a few weeks previously, told him I got married. And I said, I won't tell you now I got married, it'd take me too long. I said, next time I see you, maybe I'll tell you. And he wrote back and said, yeah, I'd like to tell me. So I arranged to see him, and I was telling him why I'd got married. And he said, yeah, nothing to argue about there. So it was, the thing is, we build him up into this great big authority figure, which he's not. He never was. But we can't help doing it because he's just the founder of the movement. But, when you're with him one-to-one, when one was with him one-to-one, unless you were, frozen with awe or whatever, it was just a delight to be with him. So I haven't been looking at my watch.
We've got about 7 minutes.
7 minutes. So let's think of another quality. What we've had so far, courage, Mudu, Uju, Suju, Mudu, directness, telling the truth. And we've had that really, haven't we? We've had telling the truth. Detail. an eye for detail. He was really, really strong on this. Apparently he's a double Virgo, and he was really, really strong. Maybe you don't know what that means, but it means someone who really takes care. And he took such care with everything. Everything he did, he took great care with it. His lectures, each one of his lectures are a model of structure. They were structured really well, and everything he says in those lectures is really well thought through. I give a lot of talks and lectures, and my talks are a little bit rough. You know, I don't quite say what I mean to say a lot of the time, but Bhante always said what he means to say in his lectures, and his books are really, really carefully written. Just say a little bit about his writing style, actually. His writing style is old-fashioned. He's from another generation, and people find his writing style difficult. And his poetry is the same. His poetry is rather old-fashioned. And what I would say to you, if you get put off by his old-fashioned style, work at it. It's a bit like saying you don't like old-fashioned music like Beethoven and Mozart and so on. It's worth getting to know some of the old-fashioned styles, because that was the modern style at the time. So it's worth getting through any problems you have with Bhante's old-fashioned style, because he's got a lot to say. Now, where was I? What quality am I talking about now?
Detail.
Detail, an eye for detail. That's right, yeah. So all his writings and all his lectures, they're really with an eye for detail. But where I saw it mostly was in his nurturing of our movement, this movement that we get so much from. So much care, so much thought has gone in to everything with this movement. Nothing has just been, oh, we'll do it. Nothing has been bodged. He's thought everything through very, very carefully. So all the way our centres are run and the way we organise ourselves and so on, Bhante has all thought it through. And whatever new problem we used to have in our order and movement, he used to think it through very carefully before coming up with a response. And yeah, it's an amazing quality that he had for absolute care for every single detail. It's something that I still aspire to, and I'm very slapdash in comparison with Bhante. I think I'll finish with just, as I did last night, talking about his kindness. This is something that you don't really experience unless you actually have had personal contact with Bhante, because kindness isn't something that sort of you can do from a distance. It's something that happens one-to-one. And I still remember my first meeting with Bhante. Lokamitra took me up to where we used to live in Norfolk. This was a few years before Padmaloka. We lived in a little cottage alone. And we got there, and we were going to spend the weekend there. We got there on the Friday evening, and Bhante had cooked a meal for us. The only meal he knew how to cook, a certain curry he knew how to, because when he was in India, he wasn't allowed to cook. Everyone was always cooking for him. So he cooked us this meal. And he spent the whole weekend with us. And one time, probably Saturday afternoon, I think it was, I was just sitting in a room reading a book, and Bhante was in there, and he was supposed to be reading, but every time I looked up, he was looking at me. And look at me, and look down. And it's funny, I didn't know him. And I felt that this man was paying attention to me. And he could see right through me. He could see just who I was. And that can be a bit scary, you know. But actually it wasn't. Because as well as the, penetration, there was also the kindness to go with it. He could see what I was like, and he was also very, very kind. And I've known him for 45 years, and I've had a lot of contact with him over that time. And looking back, I would say he was unfailingly kind to me. Unfailingly kind. Even when he had to say things to me, there were times when he was not happy with me. And he would have to say things to me, and he'd always do it with great kindness. And I saw him do that with a number of people as well. At the same time, he was pretty fearless with his kindness. There's a story in the Pali Canon of someone going to, a prince is with the Buddha, and this prince has tried to trip the Buddha up. He's tried to put him in an impossible position, and the Buddha wasn't having it. And the prince is sitting there holding his baby. And at some point, the Buddha says to the prince, if that baby swallowed something, it was choking, what would you do? And he said, well, I'd have put my finger out and pull the thing out that's choking him. He said, yeah, and the baby wouldn't like that. It wouldn't be a pleasant thing, would it? No, it wouldn't. So there you go. That's why sometimes I have to say things to people which are unpleasant for them to hear, but I'm trying to help them. And I would say that's the same with Bhante. And I don't think Bhante gets the credit due to him for what happened, how the Croydon situation was resolved. Now, I knew all about what was happening in Croydon because I was in the men's Mitra convener for Manchester at the time, and we knew what was happening in Croydon. We tried to help, but we were unable to change the situation. And Bhante was really, really unhappy about it, and he was really unhappy that some people were being unkind to others. Some of the order members were being unkind to some of the Mitras in Croydon. He was really, really unhappy about that. And it really troubled him, and he was trying to find a way to resolve the situation, and he couldn't. Eventually, he asked all the order members to go and see him at Papaloka, and not all of them went, but most of them did. And I was at Papaloka at the time, and they all went up to his study. And he just really told them off. He said, I am not letting this go on any further. And you've got a choice. You can either stay within the order, and Croydon Centre stays an FWBO as it was then, an FWBO centre, or you're going to have to go. Those are the two choices. I am not letting you carry on like this under my name. And I wasn't in the room at the time, but I was downstairs when they came downstairs. My God, they were in a state of shock when they got there. One of them had tears coming down his. They've never experienced Bhante like that, so he could be really strong when he needed to. And I think one of the things that Bhante, there were many aspects of running a Buddhist order and movement that Bhante found very painful. Because as he said himself, he wasn't really the natural person to start up a new Buddhist movement. He was not, it's not really what he was cut out to do in his life. And he did it kind of against the grain. But one of the things that I've seen time and time again with Bhante is what he found most difficult when members of the order were unkind to other people, to mitras and friends. He really didn't like that at all. And he would often pull people off about that, and he would speak about that, the importance of kindness. And to bring it all together, there's this amazing film of him. It was at the European Buddhist Union, at least a decade ago now, quite a long time ago. And there were various Buddhist luminaries in Berlin for this conference, European Buddhist Union conference, and they got these famous Buddhist teachers from all over the world, Bhante being one of them, Chogyam Trungpa, Thich Nhat Hanh, you know, the whole crowd of them were there really. And Bhante was in a I think 4 or 5 teachers were on a panel. You know, they were being asked questions. And I can't remember what the question was, but somebody asked a question and Thich Nhat Hanh answers it. And he said, it's something about Buddhist centres, and he said, well, the main thing is for the people at that Buddhist centre to be happy, because that was always Thich Nhat Hanh's main message, be happy. And it was just going to go on from there, and Bhante said, I'd just like to say something like that, if I may. And he was so polite with it. If I may, I have to disagree with you on that. Because one can't always be happy. You can't always be happy. You can always be friendly, but you can't always be happy. So he made that point, that the important thing about a Buddhist centre was friendliness, not so much happiness. And then, but he went on, and he said, and if I may say so, yesterday you, Thich Nhat Hanh, he was facing, you seemed quite unhappy yesterday, if I may say so. And so we can't always be happy. And that was like, when you're watching that film, there's all these Buddhists, being what Buddhist teachers do, which is be nice to each other and very humorous and very urbane. And then when Bhante heard Thich Nhat Hanh's answer to that question, he just wasn't going to let that go. And one of the people in the audience was the German nun, Theravada nun, Ayya Khema. Do you know Ayya Khema? The writer of a couple of books. She wrote to Bhante later and congratulated him on his courage. She said, that really needed to be said, and I wouldn't have had the courage to say it if I was on that panel. But I really, really appreciated you saying that. So all of these qualities, there are many, many more qualities that I could talk about with Bhante, but these are the ones, I suppose, that have struck me the most strongly, by which I hope I've been the most influenced by Bhante. Because if I can get anywhere close to that with Bhante, I feel I'd be very, very happy with that.